From the farthest reaches of space, one truth became undeniable. Humanity was a force to be reckoned with. This wasn't about advanced technology or superior firepower. No, this was something far more dangerous, far more primal. The reputation of humans spread across the galaxy, but it wasn't the glowing praise one might expect. The title Deathworlders resonated with a sense of danger that few, if any, truly understood. They were not creatures of delicate intellect or calculated conquest. No, they were survivors. Survivors of a planet constantly in turmoil, a world where the environment itself seemed bent on crushing its inhabitants, and yet humanity continued to endure. The title was as much a warning as it was a recognition of their unyielding will to live. But what if the greatest threat humanity posed wasn't what everyone thought? Commander Vex Talon of the Galactic Military Academy stood at the edge of an era-defining moment, his mind churning with uncertainty. In just a few hours, human cadets from Earth were set to arrive. Cadets from a world that barely survived its own violent, chaotic nature. These humans, with their reputation for unpredictability and resilience, were to walk through the Academy's doors. For decades, the Academy had prided itself on preparing elite soldiers from across the galaxy. They had mastered the art of survival, training species from worlds far beyond Earth's volatile atmosphere. But this was different. Humanity was not just another species, not another experiment. The Galactic Confederation had heard the whispers, had felt the unease ripple through the ranks. These humans were different, but nothing at all could have prepared Vex for the truth. What would happen when these so-called Deathworlders walked into the Academy? Would they prove to be the catastrophic downfall of galactic peace, or would they rewrite the very rules of survival itself and forever alter the course of history? As Vex stared into the void, a sense of anticipation and fear settled over him. The answer, he feared, might be something far darker than he could imagine. The Galactic Military Academy had always prided itself on one thing: pushing the limits of its cadets. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about surpassing the impossible. Each test, each simulation was designed to break the spirit of those who weren't strong enough to endure. The Academy's facilities were some of the harshest in the galaxy, where species from all corners of the cosmos were put to the test. These trials weren't just physical, they were mental and emotional crucibles, meant to weed out the weak and forge the strongest warriors. Commander Vex Talon had seen it all. He had watched cadets from species that could manipulate time and others that could regenerate entire limbs. He'd seen alien beings adapt to environments that seemed impossible to survive in, but none of them were quite like the humans. Earth's inhabitants were, after all, mere humans, weren't they? Primitive, chaotic, and barely above the threshold of galactic civilization. Yet, their reputation had begun to spread throughout the Academy, and with it, a growing unease. The title, Deathworlders, was one that followed them like a shadow, but it wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. As the ship carrying the human cadets docked at the Academy's station, the tension in the air became palpable. Vex stood at the viewing window, staring down at the fleet of small, worn-out vessels that had made their way from Earth. He had studied their history, read the data reports, and even watched a few of their documentaries, but none of it could truly prepare him for what was about to unfold. Earth, a planet where life was constantly on the edge of annihilation, where its inhabitants fought not just wars, but the very land beneath their feet. How could such a species be capable of producing warriors worthy of the Academy? But still, the whispers from his superiors, the rising tension among the faculty, it all pointed to one truth. The humans were coming, and nothing about that arrival would be routine. As the cadets disembarked, it was clear that this wasn't just another batch of students. The human cadets, most of them young, wore expressions that revealed nothing but quiet confidence. They were under no illusions about where they were, but there was something in the way they carried themselves, something that immediately set them apart from the others. Their eyes were sharp, their movements purposeful, and their bodies showed the kind of resilience that only comes from surviving the most brutal conditions. It wasn't long before the first simulation began, a routine test that had broken countless cadets from across the galaxy. The simulation was set in a vast, hostile desert world, with temperatures reaching extremes and violent winds capable of tearing even the toughest beings apart. The mission was simple: survive. But in this desert there was no mercy. There were no escape routes, no easy solutions. Only those who could think quickly, adapt swiftly, and endure the unrelenting environment would make it out alive. It had been designed with precision to test every possible weakness. Vex watched from the command station, his gaze never leaving the human cadets as they were dropped into the arid wasteland. His expectations were high. He had read all the reports, seen the briefings, and heard the stories. Deathworlders, they called them. Humans who had survived wars, plagues, and natural disasters that would have wiped out lesser species. But survival wasn't just about being tough. It was about adapting to the impossible. The first few minutes of the simulation were exactly what Vex expected. The environment was a brutal test of stamina, and the cadets seemed to falter at first, as the heat and winds hit them full force. Some stumbled, others dropped to their knees as the conditions set in. But then something shifted. Vex noticed the humans weren't just surviving, they were adapting. Where other cadets were following the rules of the simulation, seeking shelter from the wind or trying to find food and water, the humans did something different. They improvised. One of the cadets, a tall human male named Jackson, used the very wind that threatened to tear them apart. He noticed the way the sandstorm surged at specific intervals and suggested that the group use it to their advantage. While others scrambled for cover, Jackson and his team fashioned makeshift windbreaks, using their uniforms, creating temporary shelters that shielded them from the worst of the storms. The others watched, stunned, as the humans worked together with precision, each step planned, each decision considered. Nothing was wasted. The improvisation was not just quick, it was smart. Vex's eyes narrowed. This was not how it was supposed to go. The test was meant to break the weakest, force them into decisions that would inevitably end in failure. But the humans weren't failing. They were thriving. They were learning, adapting, like a species with no other option but to survive. The humans didn't just endure, they excelled. Hours into the simulation, as the temperature soared past survival limits for most other species, the human cadets were still moving. They hadn't just stayed alive, they were working together, coordinating in ways that showed their remarkable resilience. In a chaotic, unpredictable environment, they found order. It was as though every second was a calculated response to the unpredictable dangers around them. Their reactions were not instinctual. They had learned how to cope with the chaos of Earth, and now they used that experience to their advantage. Where others followed protocols and risked their lives in the process, the humans bent the rules, took risks, and still they thrived. When the simulation finally ended, the results were staggering. The human cadets hadn't just survived, they had won. The rest of the cadets, from species that Vex had always considered elite, stood in stunned silence, realizing that something had fundamentally shifted. Vex, too, was speechless. His expectation was simple. Humans were supposed to struggle. They were supposed to crumble under the weight of their circumstances. But no, they had shattered every expectation, showing him a side of humanity that he hadn't anticipated. The question nagged at him. Had humanity simply been lucky, or was something deeper at play here? As he walked down from the command station, Vex knew one thing for sure. The arrival of the humans would change everything. The galaxy had underestimated Earth for too long. Now, humanity was proving that it wasn't just about surviving. It was about outlasting every challenge the universe could throw at them, and Vex Talon had no idea just how deep that power ran. As the days wore on, Commander Vex Talon watched the human cadets with growing fascination and, if he were honest, a twinge of unease. From the moment they had arrived at the Galactic Military Academy, everything had felt different. These humans weren't just another species to train. They weren't just here to learn. No, the humans were something else entirely. They were breaking every rule, every expectation, and Vex found himself questioning everything he had thought he knew about survival, training, and strength. It wasn't just that the humans survived in the harsh environments of the simulations. They thrived. They didn't just meet the challenges, they defied them. While other species had been taught to stick to protocols, to follow the paths laid before them, the humans chose something different. They adapted. They bent the rules. They moved outside the lines in ways that felt almost dangerous, and they did it with a sense of camaraderie that Vex hadn't seen from any other species. It wasn't about following the training manuals or the pre-approved methods. It was about responding to the moment, adapting to the immediacy of the situation. Vex had studied Earth's history extensively before the arrival of the human cadets. He had read about their wars, their survival against environmental destruction, their technological evolution in spite of their violent past. But none of it had prepared him for what he was witnessing now. Every other species, every other cadet, relied on carefully calculated plans, drilled responses. Humanity, they seemed to do the opposite. They reacted, they adjusted, and what was more unsettling was that their reaction didn't just get them through, it got them ahead. Every simulation they entered, every challenge they faced, they were improving the methodology. And what did that mean for the rest of the cadets? The creatures from planets where life was easy, where the elements were predictable, where the rules of survival were set in stone. They were now faced with the possibility that humanity wasn't just surviving, they were outpacing everyone else. How was that possible? Vex had no choice but to confront the rising doubt gnawing at him. The very foundation of the academies. Teachings was rooted in discipline, in the predictable, tested methods that had worked for millennia. These principles of control, of perfecting what was known, had shaped the Academy's traditions, but humanity had upended all of that. Their ability to think on their feet, to create opportunities where others saw only dead ends, was something Vex couldn't ignore. It was something that rattled him deeply. How could a species that had lived in the chaos of their own planet teach the rest of the galaxy about survival? Shouldn't they be the ones learning from them? But it was more than that. Humanity wasn't just surviving, they were improving the simulations. The performance of other cadets from various species had begun to rise thanks to the unexpected influence of the humans' adaptability. Where once the aliens had relied on static methods, the humans taught them to think beyond what was comfortable, to push past the boundaries they had set for themselves. Every decision the humans made was purposeful, no matter how risky it seemed at the time. They didn't just stick to protocol, they questioned it. It was at this point that Vex realized something. Maybe it wasn't just about survival. Maybe it was about something deeper. The humans weren't just thriving in a hostile environment. They were reshaping the way survival itself was understood. The Academy had always taught its cadets that survival depended on following the rules, mastering the known. But the humans were proving that survival was about adaptation. It was about flexibility. It was about surviving in the moment, instead of relying on the comfort of a set plan. But this new realization brought with it a terrifying question. What did that mean for the future of the Academy? What would happen when these deathworlders, these unpredictable, dangerous humans, no longer fit into the mold that had served the Galactic Confederation for so long? The tension had been rising steadily over the last few weeks, but nothing could have prepared Vex for what happened next. It was during one of the most intense combat simulations the Academy had ever conducted. The simulation, a perfect replica of a hostile war zone on a jungle planet, was designed to test the cadets' combat skills and teamwork under extreme pressure. It was the ultimate test, and the stakes had never been higher. The rules were simple: work together, overcome the enemy, and survive. But as the simulation began, it became clear that the environment was far from forgiving. The jungle was alive, with danger, predators lurking in every shadow, deadly terrain that could snap a cadet's neck with a single misstep, and the oppressive heat that drained every ounce of energy. The cadets were thrown into the heart of this chaos, expected to navigate it with precision and strategy. The humans, of course, didn't just follow the rules. They didn't stick to the preordained plans. They did something no one had expected. They improvised in the midst of the simulation, with the enemy closing in and the jungle itself becoming more hostile by the second. One of the human cadets, a young woman named Emily, made a move that shocked everyone. She had been leading her group through a particularly dangerous area when the enemy forces cornered them. The obvious choice was to fight, but Emily saw something others missed, a narrow gap in the terrain that led to an escape route, but it came with a risk, a huge risk. To make it, one of the cadets would have to sacrifice themselves, remain behind and delay the enemy, while the others escaped. Emily didn't hesitate. In that split second, she made the decision that would change everything. She ordered her team to leave her behind. As the others reluctantly obeyed, Emily turned, faced the oncoming threat, and prepared to sacrifice herself for the greater good. She was outnumbered. She was unarmed. She didn't stand a chance. But somehow, she knew it would work. She trusted her instincts, and in that moment, something happened. The rest of the group made it out, just as Emily had planned. But it wasn't just luck. The enemy forces, thrown off by Emily's brave, selfless act, faltered. They hesitated, giving the human team just enough time to regroup and counterattack. The entire simulation shifted in their favor. In a moment of sheer will and sacrifice, Emily had turned the tables on the enemy and saved her comrades. Her choice wasn't just a tactical move. It was a display of something far more profound: humanity's capacity for sacrifice and courage. Vex stood in stunned silence as he watched the outcome unfold. This wasn't the logical, calculated decision he would have expected from a cadet in this simulation. This wasn't following the rules. It was something more. It was human. Could it be? Could this willingness to risk everything, to throw away the rules for the sake of others, really be the key to humanity's unparalleled survival instincts? The thought hit Vex like a thunderclap. He had spent his life studying the rules, mastering the protocols, but humanity had shown him something he hadn't accounted for: the power of the unexpected. And as he stood there, with the weight of what had just transpired pressing down on him, a new question formed in his mind, one that would haunt him for days to come. Could the humans' approach to life be the very thing that changed everything? The air was thick with anticipation as the next challenge began. The cadets, exhausted from weeks of relentless training, had yet to face the ultimate test: the planetary disaster simulation. It was the hardest test the Academy had ever devised, an event so chaotic, so unpredictable, that no species had ever made it through unscathed. This wasn't just a typical test of survival. No, this was designed to break even the strongest, the most adaptable species in the galaxy. The disaster was a simulated catastrophe on a massive scale. a planetary core breach, a volatile volcanic eruption, earthquakes of unimaginable magnitude, tornadoes, tsunamis and earthquakes ripped through the environment, all while cadets were thrown into the heart of the disaster with no time to prepare. The goal was simple: survive. But it wasn't just about survival. The disaster was meant to destroy, to create such chaos that it would strip away every shred of control, to force cadets into making life and death decisions at every turn. The C scenario was designed with the sole purpose of testing every limit. It was an environment where no one could predict the outcome, not the instructors, not the cadets, and certainly not the commander himself. The disaster scenario was built on a mathematical formula that guaranteed failure. At least, that's what the Academy had believed for years. But now, as Vex Talon stood in the command center watching the simulation unfold, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. He had seen other cadets from countless species enter this test before. Brilliant beings with exceptional strength and intelligence, with centuries of combat experience. But none had ever passed this simulation. No one had ever walked away from it unscathed. The environmental forces were too much, the system too ruthless, the odds too overwhelming. Then came the humans. Vex wasn't sure what to expect. These humans had shown flashes of brilliance, but nothing had quite prepared him for this. As the simulation began, it was immediately clear that the human cadets weren't just reacting to the environment. They were strategizing. Where others were frozen, stunned by the sheer devastation, the humans immediately fell into action. And not just any action, improvised action. They didn't follow the traditional protocols. They didn't panic like so many others would. They saw the chaos, saw the endless, unpredictable variables that even the Academy couldn't control, and they adapted. Without missing a beat, they evaluated the disaster, calculating risks and making bold decisions. The humans didn't rely on preset plans or rigid thinking. They leaned into the fluidity of the situation. They adjusted on the fly, using their surroundings in ways that were completely unpredictable. The terrain, once an enemy, became an ally. While other cadets scrambled for shelter from collapsing buildings, the humans recognized an opening in the chaos, a weakness in the system. The seismic tremors caused a rupture in one of the simulation's energy grids, and without hesitation, a human cadet, Nathan, a wiry young man with an almost unsettling calmness about him, ordered his team to exploit it. They used the very disaster as a weapon, guiding the environmental forces to their advantage. They triggered a controlled collapse of a nearby structure, using the debris to block incoming fire from the simulation's robotic enemies. They turned the landscape into a shield. Vex's heart raced as he watched this unfold. The cadets didn't just survive, they were thriving. They were outsmarting the simulation, bending it to their will. The disaster wasn't destroying them, it was empowering them. Where others saw an insurmountable challenge, the humans saw an opportunity, and they seized it with an ease that left everyone in the command center speechless. It wasn't just about strength. It wasn't just about intelligence. It was something deeper, something more primal. These humans, who had once been underestimated as deathworlders, had shown their true power, not in brute force, but in the strength of their adaptability, their resilience, their refusal to be beaten by an environment that was literally trying to crush them. And the result was undeniable. The simulation ended, but it wasn't with a routine debrief. No. The humans had done the impossible. They had not just survived, they had won. The disaster simulation, a test that had broken every other species, that had faced it, had been conquered by a team of human cadets who had done what no one thought possible. They had manipulated the environment, reworked the rules, and emerged victorious. It wasn't luck, it wasn't chance. It was something far more profound. Vex's mind was reeling. He had always believed that success, that survival, depended on adhering to a strict methodical process. He had been raised on the principles of discipline and order, with each step of the training carefully structured, each risk calculated, each action determined ahead of time. It was a formula. It was safe. But these humans had just shattered that formula. They had shown him a new way, the power of the unexpected, and it was terrifying. The humans had not only adapted to the chaos, they had embraced it. They hadn't just overcome the disaster, they had fundamentally transformed the simulation itself. In that moment, Vex understood something that shook him to his core. It wasn't just about surviving the impossible, it was about bending the very essence of the challenge to your will. The humans had altered the rules of engagement, reshaping the way survival was understood. In that instant, Vex felt something inside him change. The tight grip of tradition, of order, began to loosen. He had spent his entire career believing that survival was about control, about preparing for the worst with precision. But the humans had taught him that sometimes the greatest strength lies in letting go of control, in embracing the chaos, in adapting to whatever life throws at you. And that realization struck him hard. Humanity's greatest weapon was not their intelligence, their technology, or their physical strength. It was their unpredictability, their refusal to be bound by the rules, their resilience in the face of chaos. And as Vex watched the human cadets, the implications of their actions began to settle over him like a weight. The galaxy had misunderstood humanity. They had underestimated their potential. And now it was clear, the human spirit, in its rawest, most primal form, was far beyond any expectation. The power of humanity was in its ability to endure, to adapt, to challenge the status quo, and survive in a universe that was anything but predictable. For the first time since his arrival at the Academy, Vex Talon felt uncertain. The humans had revealed something that no one had expected, and with it, they had proven that they were not just survivors. They were a force that could not be easily contained. And the galaxy was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The impact of the human cadets' success reverberated throughout the Galactic Military Academy. Their performance in the planetary disaster simulation had been nothing short of extraordinary, and the ripple effects were immediate. What had once been a hardened, stoic institution, unwavering in its principles, now found itself at a crossroads. The methods, protocols, and techniques that had been drilled into generations of cadets were suddenly being called into question. The instructors, who had initially dismissed the humans as nothing more than unpredictable outliers, were now facing a painful realization. These humans weren't just different, they were better. It was as if the walls that had once held the Academy together had begun to crack. The cadets, especially the humans, had shattered everything the Academy stood for. The traditional doctrines of survival, of order, of control. These ideas were suddenly antiquated in the face of what the humans had achieved. The human cadets had demonstrated not just resilience, but innovation. They didn't follow the script, they wrote their own. In the face of unthinkable odds, they thrived, and the Academy was forced to acknowledge that their methods grounded in centuries of tradition, were no longer enough. But while Vex observed the unfolding transformation, with a mixture of awe and trepidation, a darker question loomed in the back of his mind. Were the humans too powerful for their own good? This wasn't about raw strength or intellect anymore. It wasn't even about adaptability. No, what Vex was beginning to realize was that humanity possessed something far more dangerous, an unrelenting ability to defy expectations. And the consequences of that were both thrilling and terrifying. They were a force of nature, but what would happen when the galaxy's entrenched powers realized just how unpredictable humanity truly was? Could such a force be controlled, or would it burn everything in its path? The Academy's leadership, much like Vex, found themselves in uncharted territory. The higher-ups of the Galactic Confederation, the very architects of order and structure across the galaxy, had begun to take notice. There was a growing unease within the ranks of the Confederation. What had humanity become? What started as curiosity and caution now had the potential to spiral into something far more volatile. The humans, with their unexpected ingenuity and unpredictable methods, had already shattered the mold. But where would that lead? Could they become a new weapon to dominate the galaxy? Or, perhaps more chillingly, would they be a force too wild to tame, an uncontrollable element in an otherwise orderly universe? The possibility of the humans becoming a weapon, or worse, an uncontrollable storm, was something the Galactic Confederation couldn't ignore. If they were truly this different, this powerful, could they be trusted? Or would their unpredictability eventually lead to a galactic disaster that no one could contain? These were questions that Vex could not answer. Yet, as he sat in his private quarters, his mind a swirl of uncertainty and anxiety, a message flashed on his comm screen. It was an official communique from the Galactic Confederation marked urgent. Vex's hand hesitated over the screen. He knew that whatever this message held, it would alter the course of everything. With a deep breath, he opened it. The message was brief, but its contents hit him like a physical blow. The cadets, all of them, humans included, were being called for a new challenge, the final exam. It was a test unlike anything they had faced so far. This was the culmination of all their training, their survival, their adaptability, and it was going to push them to their absolute limits. The tone of the message was clear. Failure was not an option. Vex's stomach twisted. The final exam. This was where everything came together, where their skills would be tested beyond any reasonable expectation. It was a test designed to break cadets, not just physically, but mentally. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving that they could endure in the most extreme, unforgiving environments, under the most brutal conditions. Vex couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creep up his spine. He had watched these humans shatter expectations over and over again, each time proving themselves to be more dangerous, more capable than anyone had thought. But this time, the stakes were higher. This wasn't just a simulation. This was the real thing. The final exam would push them to the edge. Would the humans' unpredictability, their willingness to sacrifice and adapt, be enough to survive? Would their chaotic brilliance be their salvation, or would it be the very thing that doomed them? The questions swirled in Vex's mind, but one thing was certain. The final exam was coming, and everything, the future of the humans, the academy, and possibly the galaxy, would hinge on their ability to meet this ultimate challenge. Could they survive? Could they win? The answer would come soon enough, and Vex wasn't sure he was ready to see it. But deep down, he knew that the humans had already begun rewriting the rules, and there was no turning back. The final test was upon them. Vex Talon stood, his hands clenched behind his back, watching through the observation window as the human cadets stood at the edge of the impossible. The simulation room before them was a chaotic, ever-shifting environment, an abstract fusion of deadly landscapes and technological horrors designed to push every limit. Vex had seen many species face this challenge, and he knew the sheer pressure of the test. This wasn't a scenario where success was expected. No, this was about survival. And survival was something no cadet, no matter their species, could take for granted. The human cadets had faced every trial thrown at them, and now this final exam would separate the survivors from the broken. Vex watched them as they stood, in silence, every one of them understanding the gravity of the moment. Their bodies were exhausted, their minds worn thin by the trials that had led them here. But still, there was a calmness to them. They weren't panicked, they weren't rushing headlong into a fight they couldn't win. Instead, they seemed to understand something that no one else had anticipated. This test wasn't just about strength. It wasn't about following orders or adhering to protocol. It was about survival, pure and simple. And in this test, humanity had shown time and time again that they could survive. They would survive. The simulation began with a roar of mechanical and environmental chaos. The terrain shifted violently, as though the world itself was twisting, trying to crush them under its weight. Unseen forces rattled the environment, explosions, firestorms, alien creatures closing in from all sides. No one had made it through this kind of test unscathed, no one except for humanity. And it wasn't because they were physically stronger than the others. It was because they were unpredictable. They adapted, they improvised. Vex watched in awe as the human cadets did exactly what he feared they would do. They shattered every rule of the simulation. Where others saw an enemy, they saw opportunity. Where others saw chaos, they saw a battlefield to control. In that moment, humanity did not simply meet the challenge. They redefined it. They bent the simulation to their will, using the terrain and the environment to their advantage. It was a staggering display of ingenuity. They used the dangers around them as tools, turning enemies against each other, altering the rules of engagement. For the first time, Vex felt the full weight of what the humans represented. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about an entirely new paradigm. Humanity wasn't just a species to be feared. They were a wild card, an unknown element that could not be contained. The other species had their rules, their structures, but humanity was chaos incarnate, and they were capable of altering the very fabric of survival itself. The final test ended in a blur of dust and debris. The human cadets stood amidst the wreckage of the simulation, breathing heavily but alive. They had not just passed, they had destroyed the test. They had taken the impossible and turned it into their victory. Vex stood there in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what he had just witnessed. This wasn't just an outcome, this was a transformation. And yet, as the dust settled and the lights of the simulation room flickered back on, Vex knew that this victory came with a price. The humans had proven their worth, but at what cost? They had demonstrated a power, a resilience that could shake the foundations of the galaxy. The Galactic Confederation, with its centuries of order, would need to reconsider everything. The humans had not just proven themselves, they had set a new standard, a standard that no one else had the power to meet. Vex knew the question would be raised in the coming days. Could the Confederation control this new force, or would humanity be the catalyst that tore everything apart? The Confederation was built on structure, on predictability, on maintaining balance. Humanity was chaos, and chaos couldn't be controlled. Not for long. As Vex sat in his quarters, his fingers hovering over the console, he couldn't escape the sense of dread settling in his stomach. He had to write his final report. He had to record what had happened, what he had seen. The human race had exceeded all expectations, but the truth was darker than that. Humanity wasn't just a survivor, it was a force that had only just begun to be realized. A force that could either elevate the galaxy to unimaginable heights or tear apart everything the Galactic Confederation had built. Vex's fingers finally touched the keys, and he typed the words that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Their true power had only just begun to be realized.